Here's where contractors get confused with insurance. They think general liability covers anything that goes wrong, but that's not really what it does. General liability insurance is built for physical damage and bodily injury. Professional liability is built for financial harm caused by your expertise, your recommendations, or your design decisions. And if you don't understand where that line is, you can end up with a massive uncovered claim. A lot of contractors unknowingly take on professional liability exposure every single day, especially on design build projects, structured cabling jobs, construction management work, and projects where they're giving recommendations or helping guide decisions. And the problem is, many contractors don't discover the gap until there's already a claim. So, in this video, I'll show you where general liability insurance stops and contractors' professional liability begins, the three biggest coverage gaps contractors accidentally fall into all the time, and how design decisions, faulty workmanship, and even subcontracted work can create claims your general liability policy may not cover. But before we get into where the line is between general liability and professional liability, you first need to understand something really important. Insurance companies separate physical work from professional judgment. Think about building a house. A hammer is physical. Lumber is physical. Drywall is physical. If somebody drops a beam, starts a fire, or damages somebody else's property while doing the work, that's a physical problem. That's the world general liability insurance was built for. But the blueprint, that's different. The blueprint is judgment, it's planning, it's expertise. And if the blueprint is wrong, you can build the entire thing perfectly and still have a massive problem at the end. That's really the difference between general liability and professional liability. One policy is designed for physical damage. The other is designed for financial harm caused by professional decisions, recommendations, or design work. And once you understand that distinction, the differences between general liability and professional liability become a whole lot easier to understand. So let's start with general liability insurance because this is the foundation for the entire conversation. At its core, contractors' general liability insurance is primarily designed to cover bodily injury and property damage that you caused other people. So if somebody slips and falls because of your operations, that's general liability. If your employee accidentally damages somebody else's property while doing work, that's typically general liability. If your operations cause a fire, an explosion, or some kind of accidental physical damage, that's usually where general liability comes into play. The important thing to understand is that general liability insurance is built around physical damage. That's the key. And one of the best examples of this is a boiler claim. So let's say you're cleaning or servicing a boiler and something goes wrong and the boiler explodes. Now, the explosion damages surrounding property. Maybe parts of the building get damaged. Maybe somebody gets injured. That surrounding damage may very well be a general liability claim, but the boiler itself, the actual piece of equipment you were actively working on, that may not be covered. And this is where contractors start running into some of the limitations inside general liability policies, because general liability is usually designed to cover damage you caused to other people or other property, not necessarily the specific thing you're actively working on. And once contractors start understanding that distinction, a lot of these exclusions start making a whole lot more sense. Now, one of the first major exclusions contractors run into is something called care, custody, and control. And this catches people all the time because it feels incredibly counterintuitive at first. Most contractors assume if I damage something while I'm working on it, my general liability policy should cover it. But insurance companies often separate the surrounding damage from the actual property that's in your control. So if you are repairing, cleaning, modifying, testing, or actively working on a piece of equipment, the item itself may fall into an exclusion. Going back to our boiler example. If the boiler explodes and damages the mechanical room, causes smoke damage throughout the building, or injures somebody nearby, that surrounding damage may trigger the general liability policy. But the boiler itself, that thing you were actively servicing, may not be covered because it was under your care, custody, and control at the time of the loss. And the reason insurance companies do this is because they do not want general liability policies functioning like warranties or maintenance guarantees. General liability insurance is designed for accidental damage to third parties. It is not designed to guarantee the condition of the thing you're actively working on. And this distinction becomes really important for contractors who work on expensive equipment, electrical systems, HVAC systems, production machinery, boilers, generators, anything where the item itself has significant value. Because if you assume the policy automatically covers the thing you're touching, you can end up with a very unpleasant surprise during a claim. But physical work exclusions are only the beginning. The next one catches contractors all the time because nothing physically dramatic even has to happen for there to be a major problem. A lot of contractors think, well, nothing was damaged, so why is this even a claim? And that's where faulty workmanship starts entering the conversation. Let's use structured cabling as an example. So, say you install cabling throughout a building, and 3 months later, the customer starts having intermittent service problems. The internet keeps dropping. Phones are having issues. Systems are malfunctioning. Nobody got hurt. Nothing exploded. Somebody determines the cabling was installed incorrectly. That is very different from a traditional general liability claim because now the allegation is basically your work did not perform the way it was supposed to. And general liability policies are generally not designed to pay to redo your work simply because the work itself was faulty. That's where contractors start hearing terms like rework costs, loss of use, project delays, downtime, and financial damages. And this is an important phrase to understand: pure economic loss. Because in a lot of these claims, the real damage is financial. The building owner loses productivity, systems don't function properly, another contractor has to come in and diagnose the issue. The work has to get ripped out and replaced. The claim is no longer you physically damaged somebody else's property. Now it becomes your work caused financial harm because it didn't perform correctly. And once you start moving into financial harm caused by expertise, recommendations, installation judgment, or design decisions, you start drifting away from traditional general liability territory, which brings us to probably the biggest area of confusion of all. So, what exactly is contractors' professional liability insurance? At its core, professional liability insurance is designed to respond to errors, omissions, recommendations, design decisions, and professional judgment that causes financial harm. And one of the biggest misconceptions contractors have is thinking, well, I'm not an architect or engineer, so this probably doesn't apply to me. But modern construction projects don't really work that way anymore. So today, contractors are constantly making recommendations. Run the cable this way, move the equipment over here. We can redesign this section to save money. This layout will work better. We should coordinate these systems differently. And the second your expertise starts influencing how a project gets designed, managed, coordinated, or executed, you started drifting into professional liability territory, whether you realize it or not. Let's go back to the structured cabling example because this is where the distinction becomes really clear. Imagine you're working alongside the GC and the building owner, helping determine where the cabling should run throughout the building. Maybe you recommend certain routing paths. Maybe you help coordinate where systems get installed. And maybe you're involved in some of the planning decisions. Now, fast forward 3 months. The building starts having major service issues. An independent consultant gets brought in to investigate and eventually determines the design or layout itself contributed to the problem. Now the owner has to hire consultants, investigate the issue, rip out sections of the cabling, redesign parts of the system, and reinstall everything. Notice how different this claim feels compared to a normal general liability claim. Nobody necessarily dropped anything, and nobody caused a fire. Nobody crashed a truck into the building. The allegation is your expertise, recommendations, or judgment caused financial harm. And that's the world contractors' professional liability is designed for. This is also where you start hearing about things like rework costs, project delays, loss of use, investigation expenses, and redesign costs. Because professional liability claims are often less about the physical destruction and more about the financial consequences of professional mistakes. And honestly, this exposure is becoming much more common in construction because more projects are design build, more contractors are participating in planning conversations, and more owners expect contractors to contribute expertise throughout the project. But here's the part many contractors completely miss: you can still have a professional liability exposure even if you didn't personally design the project. One of the most dangerous phrases in construction insurance is, well, the engineer handled that part. because a lot of contractors assume that if somebody else designed it, somebody else owns the liability. But that is not always how these claims work. Let's say you hire an engineer, a consultant, or a specialty subcontractor to handle part of the design work. Maybe it's fire suppression, or maybe it's structured cabling, or maybe it's mechanical systems. Maybe it's some kind of delegated design responsibility. If there's a problem later, the building owner is very often still going to pull the contractor into the claim. Why? Because from the owner's perspective, you were part of the overall project delivery process. You coordinated the work, you hired the subcontractors, you participated in the decisions. You may have contractually accepted responsibility for parts of the project. And in a lot of cases, the owner doesn't care whose internal subcontractor caused the problem. They just know the project failed and they want somebody to pay for it. So even if the actual design mistake came from a subcontractor, a consultant, or engineer, you can still get dragged into the claim because of your role in the project. And this is becoming more common as contractors take on more design, build responsibilities, and more coordination responsibilities. This is also why contractors' professional liability insurance has become much more common as a contract requirement on larger projects. Owners and GCs understand that modern contractors are no longer just building what's on the plans. They're contributing expertise, they're coordinating systems, and they're helping make project decisions. And all of that creates professional exposure. So, one of the biggest mistakes contractors make is assuming, well, I outsourced the design, I outsourced the liability. Not necessarily. And the final thing contractors really need to understand is that these policies are not just covering different types of claims, they're also built completely differently. And this is the part almost nobody explains until it's too late. General liability policies and professional liability policies are not just covering different types of claims, they're also structured differently. Most general liability policies are written on what's called an occurrence basis. And all that really means is the policy responds based on when the incident happened. So if there's a bodily injury claim or property damage claim that happened while the policy was active, the policy from that time period is usually the one that responds, even if the lawsuit shows up later. Professional liability policies often work differently. Most contractors' professional liability policies are written on a claims made basis, and this distinction is incredibly important because with claims made coverage, the timing of the claim gets reported. When it gets reported matters a lot. So let's say you finish a project today, everything seems fine, the job closes out, and you move on. Then 2 years later, somebody discovers a major design issue or coordination problem tied to the project. If you canceled your contractor's professional liability policy during those 2 years and no longer have active coverage, you can end up with a serious coverage problem. And this is one of the biggest mistakes contractors make with professional liability insurance. They think, well, the project's done, so I don't need the coverage anymore. But professional liability claims often show up long after the work is completed because it can take years for design issues, coordination problems, or system failures to become obvious. This is also why terms like retroactive dates and tail coverage matter with professional liability policies. You do not need to become an insurance expert on those concepts right now, but the important thing to understand is this. Professional liability coverage is not the kind of policy you casually let lapse if you've been doing design related work or consulting, construction management, or making professional recommendations on projects. Because unlike a general liability policy, where the policy is active at the time of the accident is usually what matters, professional liability policies care a lot about when the claim is actually made and reported. So at the end of the day, general liability insurance and contractors' professional liability are solving two completely different problems. General liability is built around physical accidents, bodily injury, and property damage. Professional liability is built around professional judgment, recommendations, design decisions, and financial harm caused by the way a project was planned, coordinated, or managed. And what gets a lot of contractors into trouble is they slowly drift into professional exposure without realizing it, especially when they start advising clients, coordinating systems, helping with layouts, recommending solutions, or taking on design build responsibilities. What looks like just helping the customer can sometimes create a completely different category of insurance exposure. And honestly, understanding general liability insurance first makes all of this professional liability insurance stuff a whole lot easier to understand. Because if you don't fully understand what general liability is actually designed to cover, it's really hard to understand where the gaps start showing up. So if you want a complete breakdown of how contractors' general liability insurance works, what it covers, what the limits mean, and some of the biggest exclusions contractors run into, click right here and watch my video, General Liability Insurance Explained, Coverage Basics for 2026.